Southern Ohio's rural counties are perfect for outdoor recreation. But the calm of this quiet community was shattered in 1989 when a sniper gunned down an outdoorsman without reason. It was only the first in a string of random, terrifying murders. Hiding in the distance behind a high-powered rifle, a madman was hunting humans along Ohio's county roads.
Starting in the spring of 1989, a madman prowled the woods and fields of rural Ohio. He was a hunter. A high-powered rifle was his weapon of choice. Joggers and fishermen were his quarry. The hunter roamed far, struck at random, and left no clues. He was as elusive as he was lethal. Investigators knew he had to be stopped, but no one knew how. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. Most murderers have a connection to their victims and a motive for their crime, but not a serial killer. His victims are randomly chosen to fulfill an uncontrollable need to kill. Often he leads an ordinary life, his family and friends unaware of his homicidal passions. But serial killers establish profiles, as distinct as fingerprints, and when a match is made, it is only a matter of time before they are caught.
The rural counties of southern Ohio are hilly, rocky, and wide open. A quiet place for coal miners, factory workers, and farmers. The kind of place where people leave doors unlocked and where violent crime is almost unheard of. On April 1st, 1989, 35-year-old Donald Welling did what he frequently did on Saturdays. He went jogging along the back roads of Tuscarawas County. His quiet morning run ended with a single shot. The rifle bullet ripped through Welling's heart, killing him instantly. Local authorities could find no motive and not a shred of evidence. The rifle was never found. November 10th, 1990, another Saturday morning, 19 months later. 21-year-old Jamie Paxton of Bannock, Ohio, rose early to go bow hunting. Leaving his crossbow in the car, he took a walk through the tall grass off State Route 9. Paxton was alone and unarmed. He didn't notice the red pickup truck that stopped a short distance away. The gunman was quiet and careful. Jamie Paxton was shot 3 times by a high-powered rifle. There were no witnesses. The killing horrified a quiet community that considered murder to be a problem for big cities. Hunting accidents are not uncommon in southern Ohio, but Belmont County Sheriff Tom McCourt knew right away that this wasn't a hunting accident.
When we saw more than one wound, we knew that it could not be an accident. That an accidental death hunting accident is called a one-shot. Plus, we saw it was a bullet wound instead of something from an arrow, and gun season was not in yet.
Sheriff Tom McCourt's jurisdiction is large geographically, but the community is closely knit. There, people work hard, and everyone seems to know everyone. McCourt even knew Jamie Paxton. What he didn't know was who killed him. The gunman had left no clues.
We checked the area for spent, empty cartridge cases, for tire tracks, for anything in that area of where we thought the shot came from. We also checked the area around the body looking for the spent projectiles that had passed through the body. We even took metal detectors in looking for the projectiles. At that time, we were unable to find anything. You're gonna run over there by the marina and see.
After interviewing Jamie Paxton's friends, family, and acquaintances, they were unable to find anyone with a motive to kill him.
Everyone in the area knew Jamie Paxton. No one that we knew of or was able, even to this day, have ever found anyone who disliked the young man.
Sheriff McCourt had an apparently random killing of a popular young man with no history of trouble.
They interviewed Fred and everything.
A seemingly unsolvable murder with no physical evidence and no witnesses. Not even a plausible theory about what happened.
I think that's about it.
After her son's death, Jean Paxton's grief impelled her to action. She began composing letters to a local paper, the Martins Ferry Times Leader, designed to draw out the killer.
There was just every time I would sit down to write a letter, I would say a prayer. And I would say, please God, just give me the words to get to the person that killed my son.
The letters were at once stern and passionate. To the murderer of my son Jamie, she wrote, would it be easier for you if I wrote words of hate? I can't because I don't feel hate. I feel deep sorrow at losing my son. You took a light from my life last November and left me with many days of darkness. Have you thought of your own death? It'll happen. Unless you confess your sin and ask for God's forgiveness, you will face the fire and fury of hell at your own death. If the killer were reading Jean Paxton's letters, he seemed unaffected by them. On November 28, 1990, just 18 days after Paxton's murder, 30-year-old Kevin Loring was on a hunting trip in Muskingum County, Ohio, some 40 miles from where Jamie Paxton was killed. While his friends finished eating lunch, Kevin decided to get a head start. Walking across a field in search of game, Loring himself became prey, unknowingly moving into the sights of the gunman. Loring was killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. The killer had taken care to commit his murders in different counties to slow an investigation that would have to take place over hundreds of rural miles. The result? Investigators in Muskingum County were unaware of the other sniper victims in nearby counties. They decided that Loring's death was probably a hunting accident. Jean Paxton never gave up. She kept writing throughout 1991, determined to draw out Jamie's killer.
And I always felt if I could get my letters into the hands of the person that killed my son, I felt that I could get a response from them.
She turned out to be right. I am the murderer of Jamie Paxton, the typewritten letter read. Jamie Paxton was a complete stranger to me. I never saw him before in my life, and he never said a word to me that Saturday. Paxton was killed because of an irresistible compulsion that has taken over my life. I knew when I left my house that day that someone would die by my hand. I just didn't know who or where. I'm an average-looking person with a family, a job, and home, just like yourself. Something in my head causes me to turn into a merciless killer with no conscience. The letter arrived at the Martins Ferry Times-Leader a few days before the one-year anniversary of Jamie's death. The letter described the Paxton murder in chilling detail. I was very drunk, and a voice in my head said, "Do it." I stopped my car behind Jamie's and got out. Jamie started walking very slowly down the hill toward the road. I raised my rifle to my shoulder and lined him up in the sights. I took at least 5 seconds to take careful aim. My first shot was off a little bit and hit him in the right chest. He groaned and went down. I wanted to make sure he was finished, so I fired a second shot aimed halfway between his hip and shoulder while he was prone on the ground. I jerked the shot and hit him in the knee. He never moved again. 5 minutes after I shot Paxton, I was drinking a beer and had blacked out all thoughts of what I had just done out of my mind. I thought no more of shooting Paxton than shooting a bottle at the dump. I know you hate my guts, and rightfully so. I think about Jamie every hour of the day, as I'm sure you do. For Sheriff McCourt, the letter was a beginning, evidence that might lead to a murderer. But he needed more. The typewriter used to write the letter, a gun. While investigators searched, the killer continued his own hunting. Saturday, March 14th, 1992. Claude Hawkins got off his midnight shift at the Pittsburgh Plate and Glass Company about sunup. It was a good time to fish, and Hawkins went straight to a favorite spot on the river below Wills Creek Dam. Hawkins had a wife and 4 children. Another outdoorsman had been killed while alone, but this one took place on federal property. The FBI stepped in. The FBI joined the hunt for the roadside sniper who just killed his latest victim on federal property. Investigators from the 3 counties involved, along with the FBI and the Ohio Division of Wildlife, formed a task force. It didn't take long to realize how few clues they had. In each case, the killer had no contact with the victim, no rifling of pockets, no robbery. Shell casings had been carefully removed, and the victims' cars were untouched. Special Agent Harry Trombitis was stationed at the FBI's Columbus, Ohio field office.
What we did know is that Mr. Hawkins died from a gunshot, and usually you would find some type of a shell casing in the area. And I remember looking very hard, metal detectors and hands and knees for any shell casings in that, and none were ever found. And so that was something that, you know, if in fact we had somebody who was evidence conscious enough to pick up the shell casing after they shot and killed somebody, we were dealing with a different brand of person here.
The multi-jurisdictional task force concluded that the death of Kevin Loring, first ruled accidental, was actually a homicide.
We got a problem.
Okay, what I got is,
Reviewing the 4 murders, the investigative team saw plenty in common. Outdoorsmen, hunters, fishermen, or joggers, alone in a rural setting, all shot with a high-powered rifle. All but one of the murders occurred on a weekend, and the killer was careful enough to leave no evidence. It was more clear than ever that a single individual was responsible. The task force was on the trail of a serial killer. As they began to mobilize, the killer struck again.
I know we can capture this person. I know we can.
10 days after the task force meeting on April 5, 1992, 44-year-old steelworker Gary Bradley left his home in neighboring West Virginia to go pond fishing in Noble County. Bradley's wife and 3 children would never see him alive again. The task force had another murder. The road sniper had to be stopped. The task force wanted to learn more about the personality of the sniper. They asked the FBI to draw up a psychological profile of the serial killer. Such an outline would be invaluable in tracking him down.
Okay, good. Well, maybe there's something there we can
Major Dane Shryock of the Coshocton County Sheriff's Office headed the task force.
Right after we had initially made an assessment that maybe these things might be linked, the Columbus FBI office set up a meeting to have the behavioral science unit come to Columbus, Ohio, and actually sit down and talk with the investigators of these 5 counties of the homicides.
The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico, Virginia, can accurately sketch personality profiles of individuals from sparse clues. Larry Ankrum is a member of the Behavioral Science Unit assigned to the road sniper case. He studied all the available evidence, the investigative reports of the 5 murders, and especially the letter that the killer had written to Gene Paxton.
Then I came back to Quantico and reviewed these cases more in detail, and I came out with a formal profile. We were probably looking for a white male. We were looking for someone that was intelligent, someone who was an outdoorsman himself, someone that wouldn't look out of place in the woods, someone that was probably responding to some significant event in his life that was going wrong at that particular time. One of the things that was apparent that it was a sniper type mentality here that we were dealing with, someone that didn't want confrontation, someone that was doing things from afar, and this is something that we see many times with our arsonists. We ought to be looking at some different types of activities that he might be involved in, such as nuisance types of offenses, shooting out windows, shooting out tires of cars, cruelty to animals, arson fires.
Ankrum believed that the violence was triggered by stress and fueled by alcohol. The task force now had a psychological sketch of the roadside sniper. And they had his letter. FBI forensic scientists studied the letter intensely. They found distinguishing features in the typeface. If they could find the typewriter it was written on, it would be easy to link the confessional letter to the owner, and thus link the murder to the murderer. They had to hurry. The sniper was still out there. On July 21st, 1992, two hunters in a state park in Muskingum County came face to face with the killer. As they moved through the brush, one of them noticed something terrifying. A nearby figure with a gun pointed right at them. They called out to him, and the man scurried away to a red pickup truck. It happened too quickly for the hunters to get a good look at the man or the vehicle's tag numbers. Bewildered, they called local police, who alerted the task force. Throughout 1992, desperate to catch a man still ready to kill, the task force investigated and cleared more than 100 suspects. By August 1992, after 3 years, the investigation had hit a dead end. The task force was badly in need of information and decided to go public.
It is in the opinion of this multi-agency task force that these homicides...
They held a press conference and issued a press release detailing the FBI profile of the man they wanted and asking anyone with information to come forward.
The FBI made a press release, and it was done at one time to mass, and it got everybody, 6 o'clock news, I mean, everybody was showing this case. And the phone started ringing instantly.
Wilson.
One of those calls, received at task force headquarters on August 26, 1992, sparked a lead. The man on the phone was named Richard Fry. He said he thought the task force should know about a high school friend of his named Thomas Dillon.
Dillon.
Investigators had a name and someone willing to talk. A task force member arranged to meet Richard Fry at a rest stop on Route 77.
Tom Dillon. I went to high school with him. We grew up together.
There, Fry talked about his old friend, Tom Dillon.
He was always a little strange.
They used to drive around rural Ohio, shooting at road signs and small animals. But Fry eventually found Dillon too eccentric and violent for his taste. Obsessed with serial killers like Ted Bundy, Dillon had taken to killing family pets and cattle and setting random fires. Fry got married and for most of the 1980s forgot about his strange friend. But in 1989, Fry ran into Thomas Dillon at a gun show in Cleveland.
Tom? Thomas.
Dillon invited him to ride along with him again, just like in the old days. Old friendships die hard, and Richard Fry again found himself driving the back roads of rural Ohio, drinking beer and shooting road signs. But Dillon had deteriorated, Fry discovered. Dillon asked whether Fry thought Dillon had ever killed anyone.
We've known each other for a long time.
20-some years, I guess.
Yeah. Do you think I could ever kill anybody?
Tom, like you said, we go way back. I mean...
He discussed how to get away with random killings, including the tactic of killing in different counties to thwart investigators.
Kill them in separate counties, you know. They never connected. And being at random, They'd have no clues whatsoever.
Not average, your average guy. by
Fry
any
said
means,
that when he read the
imagination.
press release, he immediately thought of Tom Dillon.
Tell me what kind of vehicle he drives.
He gave
Yeah,
a
it's a
description of
full
Dillon,
beat-up
including the
pickup truck.
vehicle he
Ford, I
drove,
believe.
a red pickup
Was it
truck,
red?
just like the one spotted by the
Yes,
hunters.
as a matter of fact, it is.
Lieutenant Walt Wilson of the Tuscarawas County Sheriff's Office was a task force member. His job was to follow up on leads and tips, which were coming much more frequently as press coverage of the case increased. He decided Tom Dillon fit the FBI profile and needed to be investigated.
I began to follow up on the information that Mr. Fry had given us. I went to Tom Dillon's workplace in the city of Canton.
Dillon had been employed for a dozen years as a draftsman at the Canton, Ohio Waterworks. Wilson obtained Thomas Dillon's work schedule to compare Dillon's days off with the dates and times of the murders. The purpose was to eliminate Dillon as a suspect, but he couldn't. He found that Dillon didn't work weekends when most of the incidents occurred, but that didn't prove much. However, 2 weekdays Dillon took off from work caught Wilson's attention. July 21st, 1992, the day the hunters saw a man point a rifle at them, and November 28th, 1990, the day Kevin Loring was killed.
Please.
Dillon could be the one. As the other members of the task force followed up on hundreds of leads, Detective Wilson began surveillance on Thomas Dillon. Maybe Dillon would return to a crime scene or lead investigators to more clues. The surveillance began in October 1992. Detective Wilson followed Tom Dillon on his weekend excursions, driving the back roads of southern Ohio.
Typically, a day would start around 7 in the morning on Tom's days off, the weekends usually, and he would leave his home, and sometimes he would stop at a convenience store and buy some beer, and then he would go south of his home into other counties, just driving all the back remote roadways.
On October 10th, 1992, while tailing Dillon, Wilson briefly lost track of the suspect's vehicle. As Wilson crept around a corner, he came face to face with Thomas Dillon. His cover possibly blown, his case in jeopardy, Wilson had to think fast.
I waved at him and he waved at me and we kept on going. He stopped at the end of the drive to see if I was going to stay there or not.
Wilson couldn't risk being identified. He let Dillon drive away.
My big concern was I hope he doesn't stop and ask me what I'm doing on that property, because I had all of my gear laying in the car with me, and I didn't want him to see my radios and my gear that I had with me.
A few days later, Larry Oler of Barnhill, Ohio, was hunting about 150 yards off a road in Tuscarawas County. He heard a car stop. Through the trees, he saw a stocky white male. The man lifted a rifle. Oler was unhurt and watched in terror as the truck sped away. Although Oler's description of his assailant resembled Dillon, he was unable to make a positive identification. The task force realized that Thomas Dillon was their most likely suspect. Surveillance of him would have to be beefed up. Throughout October and November of 1992, the FBI coordinated a massive air and ground surveillance. Dillon was observed shooting road signs and busting car windows with rocks. Exactly the sort of petty vandalism outlined in the FBI profile. But if they arrested Dillon for vandalism, they might never gather enough evidence to arrest him for the murders. It is difficult to tail someone on an empty rural road in broad daylight. The stakes were high. If Dillon tried another shooting and the FBI weren't in the right spot, they could have another murder. If they crowded Dillon too much, they might be found out, and Dillon would slip into hiding. The ground surveillance had to be well off of Dillon. Agent Trumbitis and Captain Shryock relied on the air surveillance as their eyes and ears. They would move in if something happened. One day, the surveillance team faced its worst fear. Trumbitis and Shryock were far behind Dillon when the air surveillance called out an alert. Up ahead of Dillon, on the road, was the classic profile of a road sniper victim, a jogger, female this time, alone, in a rural setting. If Thomas Dillon were indeed the gunman, this jogger may be irresistible bait. Trumbitis and Shryock got nervous. Hoping for the best, they sped forward. Dillon continued too, right toward the jogger. Driving at top speed, Trumbitis and Shryock frantically called to the agents in the plane. Where is he? Is he stopping? The airplane reported back. Dillon is approaching her. There is no one nearby. The agent's car hurtled forward. A call from the air. Dillon is pulling up alongside the jogger. The agents held their breath. He passed her without incident. The feeling of relief lasted only moments. The airplane radioed that Dillon had taken a right turn onto a smaller road. The aerial unit stayed on him, instructing Trumbitis and Shryock where to turn. Then a second right turn. Could he be circling back? They called to the airplane, is the jogger still there? Dillon continued to make right turns until he was back on the road the jogger had been on. His U-turn justified the agent's fear. He was going back for her. Where is the jogger? Trumbitis yelled into his radio. Cannot see the jogger, came the reply. But the agents knew she had to be somewhere ahead of Dillon. If he came upon her again, they were sure he would kill her. The air unit called in that Dillon had stopped his truck and had gotten out. He had something shiny in his hands. Would he kill her right under their noses? The jogger couldn't be seen from the air, but that didn't mean she wasn't there. The agents in the car heard shots and feared that Dillon had struck again while under their surveillance. But the airplane radioed that Dillon was shooting a stop sign. The jogger had turned off the road. She was safe, unaware of her close encounter with Thomas Dillon.
I think so.
The cat and mouse game with Thomas Dillon began to wear on the task force members.
I figure if we have 5 ground
A lot of pressure. I mean, you're wondering whether this guy today is going to go out and kill somebody and you aren't going to be able to stop it. And you know that he's probably the one that is responsible for killing other people. You're working 14, 16 hours a day. You're living out of a car. You're drinking coffee like policemen, you know, and you aren't eating right. And the stress is tremendous.
But the net continued to tighten around the suspect. The murderer, in his letter to the newspaper, had admitted being bothered by the Paxton murder and visiting his grave. Investigators returned to video footage of Jamie Paxton's grave recorded November 10th, 1991, the first anniversary of Jamie's murder. Many people paid their respects that day, but curiosity rather than respect was the agenda of one visitor photographed, Thomas Dillon. Investigators immediately recognized the man they had been tailing. Surely he was the sniper, but to earn a conviction they needed direct, incriminating evidence. After the second anniversary of Jamie Paxton's death in 1992, surveillance observed Dillon entering the Times-Leader building. He bought a copy of the previous day's paper, full of the details of the Paxton Memorial Service. The FBI had good circumstantial evidence on Thomas Dillon, but they still lacked physical evidence, a bullet, a gun, or a typewriter, to link him with just one of the victims. Hunting season was fast approaching. Dillon was still out roaming the rural roads, drunk, armed, deadly. The communities of southern Ohio had been terrorized for 3 years. The people feared going outside, but tried to live normal lives. Dillon had to be taken off the streets. The task force knew Dillon had been in trouble in the past for illegally owning a silencer and was forbidden to possess firearms, a stipulation he clearly violated during his vandalism sprees. The task force had little choice. Before he could kill again, they would arrest Thomas Dillon. But the plan wasn't just to arrest him on a weapons violation, but to convince him he was caught red-handed and get him to confess to murder. Lacking ballistic evidence and holding only a relatively minor weapons charge on Dillon, the FBI badly needed to elicit a confession. Trumbitis had a plan.
Since we knew what his routine was through the surveillances and that, where he left his residence and he would go to this dairy mart every day before he left and went on his 300-400 mile drives, we would try to make the approach at the dairy mart. And what we had was an office building right across from the dairy mart where we occupied. We took over the basement of that building. Detective Wilson and I did was we went down into the basement where we were going to conduct the interview, and we put up along the walls of the whole room maps of the areas that he drove in, crime scene photographs, newspaper articles. We wanted to make that setting just irresistible to him.
Then we're just going to, piece by piece, start laying this out in front of him and see what kind of reaction we get from him.
It would be overwhelming, and you know, it would put him in the best frame of mind for us to be able to sit down and interview him and get a confession.
Mr. Dillon.
On November 27, 1992, the plan went into effect. Their entire case so far rested on getting a confession.
The idea was for when he came out of the dairy mart, we were going to approach him, identify ourselves, and basically request that he follow us voluntarily over to this room where we wanted to share some information with him and show him some things that we knew that would interest him.
If Dillon refused, Trumbitis would raise his right hand to signal ATF agents who are responsible for making arrests in weapons cases to cuff Dillon.
And I can just remember his reaction. I mean, his jaw just for about 5 seconds, and then he composed himself and he said, "I want to talk to my attorney first."
That was the cue. Trumbitis gave the signal and the ATF agents stepped in and arrested Thomas Dillon. Dillon didn't realize it, but it was a bitter defeat for the FBI. Trumbitis thought he'd blown it, despite all the evidence he'd gathered, despite his certainty that they had the road sniper. He feared that he would see a 5-time murderer quickly released on a minor weapons charge. At the very time of Dillon's arrest, other task force members were executing a search warrant on Dillon's house. Finally, the FBI felt they would come away with the physical evidence desperately needed to link him, once and for all, to the murders. But they didn't. To their surprise, the search turned up nothing more incriminating than some area maps marked with arson and vandalism sites. Dillon was refusing to talk. They were holding him, but there was nothing they could do with him.
It was pretty much over when he said he wanted to talk to his attorney. So we went back to the restaurant and we were going to have a cup of coffee, and all of a sudden we got the word that he wanted to talk to us. And so Walt and I jumped into our car and we made a beeline to Stark County Jail.
Trombitis and Wilson confronted Dillon with one piece of evidence after another. Photographs, videotapes, newspaper clippings showing his link to the murders.
I would pull out one piece at a time and show him, and just as we had suspected, he just was keenly interested in the information that we had, the surveillance pictures, the crime scene photos, you know, just the animal, you know, the shots of the animals that we had along the roadways and that. You could just see that he was just fascinated by that.
Fascinated but not talkative, Dillon said it would serve no purpose to admit anything now. Another dead end for the FBI. Dillon's attorney is arguing that he should be spared jail time on the weapons charge. Now, unless something turned up on him very quickly, Thomas Dillon would have to be released.
Thank the various representatives of the media for showing up today.
The task force was now fighting the clock. Desperate for physical evidence, they held another press conference, appealing to the public for any information about guns they may have bought or sold with Thomas Dillon.
Haven't had any contact with Mr. Dillon.
Meanwhile, task force member Jerry Wade of the Ohio Division of Wildlife was following up on a tip. A witness steered Wade to a spot where he had seen Thomas Dillon firing his rifle a couple of years back. Wade hoped that would lead him to some ballistic evidence to link Dillon to one of the killings.
This individual that brought it to our attention that he'd seen Thomas Lee Dillon shoot this deer with a rifle thought the rifle might be one of them that was used. And if we could locate some physical evidence, the shell casings per se, and if we could get those and match them to the murder weapon, we could put that rifle in Thomas Lee Dillon's hand prior to the murders, which would really give us a lot stronger case as far as him possessing the rifle prior to the murders.
The chances of finding small shells in such a wide area were slim, and it had been 2 years since the rifle had been fired there. Determined, Wade patiently combed inch by inch through a grassy field where the anonymous witness said he saw Dillon shoot the deer. Beginning at the tree described by the witness, Wade searched the area in a circular pattern by hand and with a metal detector, carefully marking off the territory. Miraculously, Wade hit the jackpot. He found 2 rifle shell casings, later identified as coming from the same gun that killed Gary Bradley and Claude Hawkins. Finally, a physical link to the murders.
I felt like celebrating. It was just unbelievable that I found them, because after the time, the length of time that had been since the shooting and the incident, and the individual wasn't sure the location of the tree exactly. The scene had changed since he had been there. They had removed a fence row and pushed out the area. So I felt very, very much fortunate to find him, and I felt like a celebration at the time. It was just like, you know, it was a gift handed to you.
Meanwhile, the publicity from the press conference asking the public for help was about to bear fruit. On December 4th, Captain Shryock was manning the phones at Task Force headquarters. A man named Al Cope was on the phone.
Can you give me that?
He said he bought a weapon from someone who may have been Thomas Dillon at a gun show the previous spring.
I'll tell you what, if you give me about 15 minutes, sir, I'll be right there.
The date? April 5th, the same day Gary Bradley was murdered. The rifle was sent to the FBI laboratory in Washington for ballistics testing. Special Agent Paul Schrecker is a ballistics expert for the FBI.
As the bullet passes down the barrel of the weapon, that bullet, by coming in direct contact with the interior of the barrel of the weapon, picks up the microscopic imperfections, the microscopic features of that barrel. So that bullet is marked with the fingerprint of that barrel.
Fragments of bullets taken from the bodies of victims Claude Hawkins and Gary Bradley were examined at FBI labs.
A bullet fragment may still be of value for comparison. Even though a bullet may fragment, may break up as a result of striking a victim, and maybe only fragments are ever recovered, those fragments are still marked. They still bear the impressions of the inside of the barrel of the weapon. And those fragments can still be used to make a positive association or an identification. When the weapon was submitted to our laboratory, the weapon was test fired, and the test fired bullets from this weapon were then compared to the bullet fragments taken from the victims.
Al Cope's gun was test fired, and the bullets examined for characteristics they may have in common with the bullet fragments taken from Gary Bradley and Claude Hawkins. The conclusion? Al Cope's gun, sold to him by Thomas Dillon, matched the gun used to kill both Gary Bradley and Claude Hawkins. The FBI finally had the goods on Thomas Dillon.
Close the door, please.
Agent Trombitis visited Dillon in jail and confronted him with the evidence. He and his truck fit the descriptions of the few witnesses. He had been off work when each murder had occurred. He had a history of random violence and gunplay. And the FBI could prove in court that a gun he once owned killed at least 2 of the victims.
What kind of proof?
What kind of proof? All the proof we need.
But Trombitis knew Dillon was guilty of all 5 murders, and he wanted closure for the victims' families. He offered Dillon a deal. As leverage, Trombitis reminded Dillon that he faced Ohio's electric chair. Dillon got nervous, and he began to negotiate.
And what's your assessment of the situation? I still can't believe you got that hard evidence. Well, we have evidence.
Thomas Dillon met with the prosecutors in June of 1993. He agreed to admit to 5 killings if the death penalty were dropped as a possible sentence.
Terms, 1 each for each of the acts committed.
On July 9th, Dillon confessed to prosecutors in order to save his life. On July 12, 1993, a smirking Thomas Dillon walked into the Noble County Courthouse to make his plea.
Mr. Dillon, at this time, how do you plead to count 1 in the indictment in case number 93 CR4 involving the death of the aggravated murder charge involving the death of Gary Bradley? How do you plead? Guilty.
With the families of the victims watching, Dillon confessed to murdering Donald Welling, Kevin Loring, Claude Hawkins, Gary Bradley, and Jamie Paxton. He was still smirking and unrepentant as he left court.
At this time of the indictment in case number 93 CR4. Guilty.
Hello?
Jolene. Hi.
Tom.
This is Thomas. Yeah.
Dillon's incredibly cavalier attitude was detailed by a local reporter whom Dillon repeatedly called from prison,
Can't get enough of me.
marveling at his own violence, reveling in his celebrity, and laughing off the murders.
Let's talk about the other guys. I mean, they
Except
were
one.
really good shit.
He would not discuss
I
the
wanna talk
murder
about
of
Jamie
Jamie Paxton.
No, forget it, all right? Just forget it.
Jean Paxton, Jamie's mother, was in court the day Dillon pleaded guilty.
I just want to talk to him about Jamie, the kind of person Jamie was. Jamie was everything Thomas Dillon could never be. He is, Dillon is a coward, he hid behind a gun, and Jamie was not that way. Little did I know that on the evening news he was watching that, and it made him very angry that I had called him a pathetic coward.
We talked to him about remorse and how did you feel after these homicides? And the only one that he said that it really bothered him about was Jamie Paxton. He said, "I didn't realize the kid was so young."
Jean Paxton had looked forward to confronting Dillon in court, but his guilty plea cost her that opportunity. She asked Sheriff McCourt to arrange a conversation.
Hi.
McCourt agreed. That evening, Jean
Thomas
Paxton's phone
Dillon.
rang. She found herself speaking with the murderer of her son.
When I picked up the phone that evening, it was just like somebody calling up to sell me something. He said, "Mrs. Paxton, this is Tom Dillon." It was just almost more than I could comprehend. The tone of his voice, the way he came across. Still, the arrogance was there.
You really hurt my feelings this afternoon when...
Dillon told Jean Paxton that when she called him a coward, she had hurt his feelings.
I really don't think he expected to get what he got from me. I think that Thomas Dillon could have handled the crying, the screaming, the saying of calling names, the cursing. I think he could handle that, but I did not lower myself to that level. I talked to him as a mother, and I really feel that through this whole thing, that is what got to Thomas Dillon.
Well, I understand.
After 3 years, Jean Paxton felt vindicated.
I felt really good. I walked out on my front porch, and I just felt like for the first time in 3 years that I was free. I was free of Thomas Dillon. I felt that I had defeated him by words, and I did it all for Jamie.
Thomas Dillon made it clear he did not want to go to Lucasville Prison, the toughest in Ohio. So Jean Paxton saw to it, with a petition drive, that was exactly where Dillon was sent. In August 1993, Jean Paxton won a $25 million wrongful death judgment against any future money Dillon might make. Dillon's wife had been trying to sell his story to Hollywood. Paxton and State Senator Bob Nye passed the Paxton Bill, barring killers or their relatives from profiting from the crime. Thomas Dillon remains in Lucasville Prison. He is eligible for parole in 165 years. One by one, prostitutes die across Central Europe. Austrian authorities believe one man is responsible. But they have no experience hunting serial killers. They turn to an FBI profiler for help. He finds the same killer has come to America, and the death count keeps rising until the FBI stops him.
Beginning in 1990, Europe found itself in the clutches of a serial killer. He became an international outlaw, hopping from country to country to evade capture and to kill again. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Legal cooperation between countries and continents is not common, but neither are serial killers in Europe. Desperate to apprehend him, Austrian authorities called on the FBI for help.
In Austria, the exchange of sex for money has been legal for years. Here, prostitutes walk the streets for men willing to pay for their services. Throughout most of the 1980s, Heide Marie Hammerer worked in the city of Bregenz as a prostitute. A licensed professional for almost 10 years. She was used to unusual requests. But on the night of December 5th, 1990, a customer went too far. The killer hurriedly redressed his victim, Then he dragged her through a secluded forest some 10 miles away and left her body. The crime went undiscovered for 3 weeks. On the morning of New Year's Eve, 1990, a pair of hikers stumbled upon Hammerer's body. Though the body had been left exposed to the elements, the winter temperatures helped preserve the remains. Austrian authorities determined that Hammerer had been strangled with her own pantyhose. Her wrists were bruised from restraints. At the autopsy, they found no sexual discharge on her body. But they did find fibers that were inconsistent with her clothing. She was only the first victim. Over the next several months, 3 more prostitutes died violently throughout Austria. Brunhilde Masser was recovered in a stream bed near Graz. Elfriede Schrempf, also from Graz, was found nearby in the woods. Near Vienna, Sylvia Zagler was discovered in a stand of trees. The women had all been bruised, strangled with their pantyhose, and left in various states of undress, lying face down in wooded areas. The Austrian public was shocked. On April 4th, 1991, the authorities gathered their most experienced investigators to focus on the slayings. Because of the similarities in the 4 cases, investigators reasoned that one person was responsible. Austria had its first serial killer in modern history. They had no experience investigating these offenders. Dr. Ernst Geiger, one of Austria's leading detectives, was assigned to coordinate the hunt.
No lead was promising. All the leads ended nowhere. We had no real suspect.
The first break came when a retired policeman read of the murders in a Salzburg newspaper. They reminded him of a case he solved in 1974. Detective Geiger received a phone call from the retired officer. 15 years earlier, he told Geiger, a young woman had been strangled with one of her undergarments and dumped in the woods. Just like the present victims. The killer was caught and convicted, but had recently been paroled. Detective Geiger took the name of the ex-convict, Johann Jack Unterweger.
Jack Unterweger was paroled after 15 years because he had murdered a young girl before, and while he was in prison, he became a writer, quite a famous writer.
But was it possible that this famous writer could be a serial killer? Geiger and his team began looking into the journalist's background. Until 1990, Jack Unterweger had led a difficult life. He was born to a German prostitute who quickly abandoned him. He suffered neglect and abuse, shuttling between various foster situations. As a teenager, Jack began to play out the rage of his dismal childhood. By age 25, that fury earned Unterweger a life sentence. Unterweger continued his education and started writing while in prison. He published letters, plays, short stories, and an autobiography. In the book that became a bestseller, Unterweger painted a tragic tale of himself as victim. Critics and the public alike embraced the author for the apparent honesty with which he confronted his past. The literary community suggested that art had redeemed him. Eventually, the press and the public at large demanded that his life sentence be commuted. On May 12, 1990, Austrian authorities agreed. The 40-year-old Austrian walked out of prison. He was a free man, determined never to spend another minute of his life behind bars. Shortly after his release, he was hired by a major German magazine to cover the prostitute murders. He promised to use his writing in a socially conscious way. He told his editor that he wanted to give voice to the dispossessed, caught in the underbelly of society, as he once was. By July 1991, after 2 more prostitutes were found strangled, psychologist Tom Mueller of Austria's Criminal Investigation Division joined the team.
When we started the investigation against Jack Unterweger, it was pretty hard because all his friends were within the media and they couldn't understand that he could be the bad guy.
Even among investigators, only a handful considered this celebrity journalist a possible suspect. Through receipts and travel records, Geiger and Mueller learned that Unterweger had been at each murder location. This was not suspicious in itself, since he was covering the story as an investigative journalist. Yet he always reached those destinations before the murders took place. Investigators also discovered that Unterweger had visited Prague in September 1990, just before a Czechoslovakian woman, Blanka Bokova, was strangled with her pantyhose. She was the earliest victim in the string of murders that now totaled 7.
And what was outstanding for us, that exactly at any time where Czech hang out at any place in Prague, in the western part of Austria, in the southern part of Austria, exactly in that time period there was always a dead body somewhere in the woods.
In Austria, another woman, Regina Prem, had been missing for months and presumed dead. Her family waited desperately for news of her fate. In October of 1991, the grief-stricken husband and son received a chilling phone call to their unlisted number. The caller told him that he was Regina's killer and described what she was wearing the night she disappeared. The caller claimed that he was the executioner, that God ordered him to do it, that she was left lying on the place of sacrifice with her face turned towards hell. The phone call was cruel torture to an already traumatized family. When police recovered her body, they confirmed Regina Prem was the killer's 8th victim to date. The discovery put them no closer to stopping the killer. Vienna, October 22, 1991. Austrian authorities questioned Unterweger for the first time. With no hard evidence to connect him to the crimes, they hoped for a confession. He admitted to consorting with prostitutes for his writing assignments and for sex. But he denied knowing the victims. Although his alibis were weak, investigators were forced to release him. Their evidence was merely circumstantial, and his public support was growing. But Mueller and Geiger still believed Unterweger was a strong suspect and continued digging into his past. They tracked down the car Jack drove when he was first released from prison. But it had been a year since he sold it, and the likelihood of finding any usable evidence was slim. The team uncovered little, except a hair fragment.
It's good. It's good.
Although it was a long shot, investigators sent the hair fragment to the University of Bern for analysis. Enough of the hair root remained for lab technicians to extract a DNA sequence. That sequence was compared to those of the victims. Of the 8 women slain, the DNA from the hair matched the earliest victim from Prague, Blanka Bokova, killed in September 1990. It was a breakthrough, But that only proved the woman was in the car when Jack owned it. Investigators needed stronger evidence. Now back at police headquarters, Geiger questioned Austrian prostitutes. They recognized Unterweger as a regular customer who insisted they wear handcuffs during sex. More importantly, one recalled seeing him approach her friend, Heidemarie Hammerer, the first victim discovered in Bregenz. She also remembered he wore a brown leather jacket on that night. On the strength of this identification and the hair fragment found in his car, Geiger obtained a warrant to search Unterweger's apartment.
Jack, Unterweger? Polizei!
When the police arrived, Unterweger was nowhere to be found. They took away clothing, including a brown leather jacket for forensic examination. Then one of the detectives discovered some receipts in a trash can. They were from a seafood restaurant in Malibu, California, dated 9 months earlier. Jack Unterweger had been to the United States. But the apartment search yielded less than the investigators had hoped. They found no hard evidence that directly tied Unterweger to the slayings. Since their case was still too weak to issue an arrest warrant, the investigation stalled. Jack Unterweger was still one step ahead. To stop him, Geiger needed help from those more experienced with catching serial killers. He needed the FBI. The Austrian investigators visited the U.S. Embassy. They met with legal attaché Julianne Slisko, an FBI agent stationed in Vienna.
I'm hoping you could help us with the FBI.
Slisko called the Criminal Profiling Unit in Quantico, Virginia.
Hi, Agent McCrary.
She was patched through to Special Agent Greg McCrary.
Killings here in Austria.
Now retired, McCrary spent the last 10 of his 25 years in the FBI, pioneering the science of profiling.
The Austrians contacted the FBI because they were trying to tap into our experience of dealing with serial homicide investigations. This was the first serial murder investigation in modern history in Austria.
McCrary agreed to assist the Austrians. He would help them determine if one perpetrator could have committed all the murders. When Geiger told Slisko that Unterweger had traveled to LA the previous summer, she authorized a telex to be sent to California to inform local authorities. Over the next several days, Geiger and Mueller prepared for their trip to the FBI, packing crime scene reports, autopsy protocols, and photos. Then they received a call from LA detective Fred Miller. Miller had received their telex and said that California had suffered a similar pattern of killings during the prior summer. Now investigators turned their attention to LA, 6,000 miles away, in the hunt for the Austrian serial killer. By the fall of 1991, 8 women had been found dead in Central Europe. The prime suspect was Austrian celebrity writer Jack Unterweger. But little forensic evidence tied him to the crimes. And the public believed the police were pursuing an innocent man. An FBI telex from Vienna to California caught the attention of Los Angeles detective Fred Miller. He and his partner, Jim Harper, had been working for months on a series of unsolved murders. In style and pattern, the LA crimes resembled the ones that Unterweger was suspected of in Austria.
This immediately lit the fires, and it was just unbelievable to go all these 8 months and without the suspect turning up or another murder. This was quite a boost to the investigation.
The American and Austrian investigators compared notes. The cases were clearly similar. The victims were prostitutes. All had been strangled using intimate apparel. And all the bodies were left in remote locations. Now, Miller and Harper began to reconstruct Unterweger's visit to California. They checked the airlines, car rental agencies, and hotel logs. From these, they created a timeline of his movements.
We learned that he came to Los Angeles in June of '91 on vacation, right around June the 2nd or 3rd, and that he left around the 17th of July.
In the summer of 1990, Unterweger visited LAPD headquarters.
I'm a journalist, and I am interested.
He strolled into the public relations office, presented his press credentials, and signed up for the Ride-Along program.
And the Austrian police.
This program allows civilians to tag along with police in their cruisers as they patrol the city.
Tonight at 8:30
As all Jack's credentials were in order, the request was accepted.
It's Jack Unterweger.
Unterweger claimed he was writing a German magazine story, contrasting American and European prostitution. He asked to be shown where the city's prostitutes hung out. The officers introduced him to the seedier areas of Los Angeles. Detective Jim Harper explains.
I mean, if you come to a city as big as Los Angeles, prostitutes don't hang out everywhere. You gotta know where they hang out. What better way to do that than get a ride along with the police department?
Witnesses last saw 21-year-old Shannon Exley in the vicinity of 7th Street and Main Street.
What's that you're saying?
She had been working the streets since she'd run away from home at 16. Her life ended on June 20th, 1991. Her nude body was found with her bra wrapped around her neck. Marks on her feet told investigators she had already been strangled when she was dragged some 50 feet to where she was found.
The lacerations across her neck.
Medical technicians were able to isolate DNA sequences from the semen of 7 men. But LA detectives had no suspects with whom they could compare the samples. 10 days later, investigators discovered a second prostitute, Irene Rodriguez. She was found behind a tractor trailer, only 1.5 miles from where Exley's body had been dumped. Both women had been strangled with their bras, and both were last seen in the vicinity of 7th and Main Street. The detectives discovered that Unterweger was living nearby.
We learned that he stayed at the Cecil Hotel, which is located at 643 South Main, which is right on the corner of 7th and Main Street, and that's the location where, close proximity where both our victims were last seen.
A third victim, Sherry Long, was found near Malibu less than 2 weeks later. Once again, Unterweger was staying at a hotel in the vicinity Long was last seen. Around her neck, her bra was tied tightly. Detective Jim Harper remembers the unique method of strangulation.
The way the bras were tied around their neck was nothing that I had seen before. Look, somebody took a lot of intricate time to really take time with the victim and put it around their necks and tie it.
Los Angeles criminalist Lynn Harold compared the knots to see if there was a pattern in the way each had been made and tied.
In order for the knots to be made, the wearing apparel had to be dismantled in some form. It's not like the bras were just taken and tied in a square knot, but they were stripped of the elastic always on the left side. And if 3 people randomly went out and strangled 3 people, it is extremely unlikely that all 3 of them would come up with this same scenario.
Now Geiger and Mueller added the information from the Los Angeles murders to their own case and headed to Virginia. They hoped that the FBI could determine whether one man had indeed killed all 11 women. Back in Austria, Jack Unterweger maintained a high profile. The celebrity journalist continued to publish his articles and appeared on television to talk about the murders. He told audiences that the Austrian police were inept at finding the real killer and had singled him out as a scapegoat. Unterweger claimed that the authorities were determined to send him back to prison, even if that meant framing him for the grisly crimes. Unterweger remained popular with the public at large and in the nightclubs where he was a regular. To his fans, and especially women, he was still charming. He boasted the police had no evidence, only theories. And they would never be able to send him back to prison. In August 1992, Austrian detectives arrived at Quantico, Virginia. They needed an experienced FBI profiler to help them capture the serial killer that had left 11 women dead in Central Europe and California. The Austrians came with 12 boxes of evidence. Special Agent Greg McCrary refused to look at any information on the prime suspect, Jack Unterweger. He didn't want any preconceived notions to interfere with his analysis. Instead, McCrary wanted to focus on the victims.
I wanted all the case materials on all of the homicides, victimology, a lot about the victims and their background, their history, the method and manner of death, autopsy reports, crime scene photos, everything that was available from an investigative point of view. What we didn't want is suspect information. We just wanted to take an objective look at all of the cases to see what we thought, if they might be related or not, and the type of offender that we thought might be most probably involved in committing these crimes.
Let's get to work.
McCrary did not presuppose that the crimes were linked. He examined the similarities among the cases to see if they were unusual enough to have been committed by one perpetrator. He began to look for a behavioral thumbprint, a criminal signature in each of the murders.
A signature crime analysis is an assessment of the behavioral aspects of the crime, which can in some cases be a single event, but more often it's a constellation of behaviors that are consistent from crime to crime to crime. And this allows us to link crimes together behaviorally based on the behavior of the offender.
Could you push this one back? Yes.
McCrary looked for patterns. He examined everything known about the 11 women. How similar were their lifestyles? Almost all the women were prostitutes, except for the first woman slain in Prague.
Mr. McCrary, this is a map of Vienna.
A companion last saw Blanka Bokova on September 14, 1990, leaving a bar in Prague, Czechoslovakia. Bokova worked as a sales clerk at a butcher shop, but was known to trade sex for favors. Her body was left on the bank of the Vlatva River in a stretch of woods near Bokova's home. The killer had strangled her with her own nylon stockings. He left her naked, covered with sticks and twigs. He threw her clothes and identification in the river. The first victim Austrian police found had been a registered prostitute for 10 years, Heide Marie Hammerer. In the early part of her career, she had suffered several violent attacks from customers, so she was known to be cautious. Hammerer was last seen outside a parking garage on December 5, 1990. Like the first 5 victims, Hammerer was found in the woods close to water. They all had restraint bruises on their arms and wrists. And autopsies found no semen on any of the European victims. To the profiler, this suggested that the killer struck out of impotence. He was terribly insecure about his masculinity. When he could not perform after being sexually stimulated, the killer lashed out in anger. He strangled the women he blamed for shaming him. Then he left their bodies in humiliating positions. Next, they focused on the LA murder victims. Did they fit the pattern that had been established in Europe? Shannon Exley was found face down in a grassy area near a freeway exit. She was nude except for a t-shirt and a pair of socks. She had been dragged 50 feet from the pavement to the location where she was discovered, after being strangled with her brassiere. Again, this crime, like the others in LA and Europe, showed the killer had preferences and that the violence itself had become erotic to him.
It became clear that there was a pattern to these homicides, that there was sort of a ritualistic behavior that occurred in each of these crime scenes. Each woman was similar in nature, either a prostitute or a woman who traded sex for favors. They were on the street when they were contacted, when they were picked up, usually very surreptitiously. No one really saw these women get into a car. They were transported out to an area, they were murdered, ligature strangled with an article of their own clothing, disposed in a similar manner in an outdoor setting, absence of sexual assault.
All right, roughly from where she was last
After a week, the study of the victimology convinced McCrary that there had indeed been only one killer behind the 11 homicides. The FBI agent and the Austrian detective spent the following week drawing up a profile of the assailant. The evidence suggested the killer had a good degree of mobility. He was older, intelligent, sophisticated, and an organized offender. To criminal psychologist Tom Mueller, this described Jack Unterweger.
I would say Jack was a very, very good example for a typical type of organized offender, and I would say he was a typical example for a natural psychologist. He was able to understand the needs of other people. He was able to come close to other people, to listen to other people, and then to manipulate them.
But the geography worked against the theory that there was one killer. The murders had occurred in Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Los Angeles. With minor exceptions, most serial killers stay regional and prey within a comfort zone. But enough time had elapsed between the slayings to permit one culprit to move around. Now the profiler compared Unterweger's travels to the chronology of the murders.
And when I overlaid Jack Unterweger's timeline on the timeline of the crimes, they fit perfectly. And that was really a dawning moment, the aha moment, the moment that's really exciting in analysis like this, because now you have a suspect whose movements correlate perfectly with each of the homicides, as well as his prior homicide that he had been convicted for, bearing a lot of similarities to these homicides. We can put him in each place at each time these crimes occurred. And either Jack Unterweger was the unluckiest man in the world to have been there, or he was an excellent suspect.
In Austria, Unterweger continued to enjoy his freedom and notoriety. Some women still found him appealing, even though the former convict was a prime murder suspect. This perplexed Detective Fred Miller.
One of the interesting facets of Jack Unterweger was that he could carry on a normal relationship with a female and still be this cruel and murder other females.
High school student Bianca Mrak was one of those that fell under his charm. The impressionable 18-year-old met Unterweger in a wine bar where she worked as a waitress. She was flattered by the attention from the celebrity writer. He told her he was tiring of all the publicity in Austria and might leave the country, maybe to Switzerland. She agreed to go with him wherever he went. August 1992. Agent Greg McCrary of the FBI worked with Austrian detectives to solve a series of 11 murders. 8 women were killed in Central Europe, 3 more in Los Angeles. All circumstantial evidence pointed to celebrity journalist Jack Unterweger as the culprit. Then they received a phone call from the University of Bern. Austrian lab technicians had completed the fiber analysis of clothing confiscated from Unterweger's apartment weeks before. The inspection had yielded results. Fibers from the lining of the brown leather jacket matched those on the body of Heide Marie Hammerer, the first prostitute found. It was hard forensic evidence that tied Unterweger to one of the victims. But investigators wanted to conclusively link the suspect to all the victims. The FBI had another tool that could do just that, VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. The computer database holds the details of 10,000 solved and unsolved U.S. homicides. A programmer inputted the particulars of the European and Los Angeles cases. Details of the victims, their manner of death, locations where they disappeared, and where they were found were all fed into the computer. McCrary ordered an extensive breakdown, a multi-dimensional search with 15 cross criteria that could show if the crimes were connected.
I certainly will, Mr. McCrary.
48 hours later, the detectives were called back to the VICAP room to hear the answer. The results were stunning. The computer statistically linked all 11 slayings. Jack Unterweger was the killer.
I hope it's worth the names for you.
The FBI had given the Austrians solid proof for their case. But Unterweger was still at large. The Austrian detectives immediately returned to Vienna. Armed with the FBI profile, authorities issued an arrest warrant for Johann Jack Unterweger. Again, the police descended upon the writer's residence. But Jack was gone. He had abandoned his flat. Geiger called his office and ordered his team to check all of Austria's ports of exit. Within hours, all train stations and airports were canvassed. But they found no sign of Unterweger. The serial killer was gone. Unterweger had already fled with Bianca Marak beyond the reach of Austrian authorities.
Jack Unterweger is a very good representative of an intelligent psychopath. He became an award-winning author and playwright, but psychopaths are very, very manipulative, and they have a supreme ability to con other people.
Hello? Hello? Yeah. Yeah, ich bin here.
On a stop in Paris, Jack called into television shows and protested his innocence. He said his flight was not an admission of guilt, but an attempt to evade a frame-up by the police. He promised to return to Austria and answer all questions if the arrest warrant was withdrawn. Despite his media appearances, the Austrian police had no idea where Unterweger was hiding. In Vienna, investigators interviewed Unterweger's friends. They were unfazed by the fact that he had been indicted for multiple murders. They said that Jack had run off for a holiday in America with Bianca Marak, a former waitress from the wine bar. Bianca was known to live with her mother, so Geiger paid a visit to Mrs. Marak.
Mit wem?
She acknowledged that she had been in contact with the fugitive couple, sending them money via wire transfers. They were in New York and heading down to Florida. Geiger told her to contact him if her daughter called again. Mrs. Marak agreed. Just days later, she got a call from Miami. Her daughter needed more money. Mrs. Marak promptly informed the Austrian police. U.S. Marshals were waiting at the Western Union. The Marshals ID'd the couple as they drove up.
U.S. Marshals, you're under arrest! U.S. Marshals, you're under arrest!
Unterweger was quickly apprehended. He was jailed in Miami to await extradition. Both the nation of Austria and the state of California wanted to prosecute him. LAPD Detective Fred Miller began conferring with his Austrian counterparts.
After Jack's arrest in Miami, we dealt almost on a daily schedule with the Austrian authorities, trying to put the information they had on their murders together with the information on the California murders. The Austrian authorities made trips to Los Angeles. They provided us with whatever materials we needed, photographs of the crime scenes, information on the victims, information on Jack.
The Austrians wanted to prosecute Unterweger in their court for all 11 murders. But they knew that would be difficult. The Austrian public perceived Jack as a celebrity. Detectives would have to convince them that Jack's private evil side was the reality. Special Agent Greg McCrary explains.
What's interesting with Jack, if you look at different pictures from different parts of his life, many times he's nattily attired with a bow tie and has this almost young, innocent-looking face. But then if you see him with his shirt off and you look at these really diabolical, involved prison tattoos that are typical of the more violent psychopathic offenders you have in prison, you see the dichotomy between Jack's outward appearance and the inner psychopathology becomes more apparent.
I've always tried to get
The LAPD detectives obtained a search warrant for tissue samples from the prisoner. In Miami, a technician drew blood, took hair samples and swabs of saliva for DNA testing. The samples were sent back to a Los Angeles lab for analysis. His DNA matched that found in the semen from Shannon Exley. But Exley's body contained semen from 6 other men, and there was no sexual discharge found in the other 2 LA prostitutes. Jack Unterweger worried that he would be transferred to California, where a death penalty was possible. He did not want to die in the gas chamber. But if he went back to Austria, he could be tried for the crimes on both continents. Criminal psychologist Tom Mueller explains.
If an Austrian citizen is committing a crime wherever in the world, the Austrian law is responsible for that guy. So the American authorities gave the clearance to bring Mr. Unterweger here back to Austria.
But Unterweger could delay this by fighting extradition.
How are we going to Austria?
You know, Jack.
LA detectives pressured him. They assured Unterweger that he would be found guilty in California and reminded him of the state's death penalty.
Of these crimes.
Fearing the gas chamber, he agreed to deportation.
You'll sign the extradition.
Despite the evidence, he still enjoyed popular support at home.
Let's go.
And Unterweger believed he could persuade a jury that the authorities were wrong. But the Austrians were betting on the FBI profile. When Jack Unterweger returned to his native Austria, he faced 11 counts of murder. 7 women were killed on Austrian soil, but the laws of the Central European country allow its citizens to be tried for crimes committed anywhere in the world. The murder indictment had done little to diminish the writer's support in the media. As he sat in jail awaiting trial, Jack continued to lobby the press that the police had framed him. His case saturated the news. In this highly charged environment, Austrian prosecutors prepared for trial. If they wanted to win, they had to present an airtight case. LAPD detective Jim Harper journeyed to Vienna for the trial.
The OJ case here in LA is the only thing I can kind of equate it to. It was that big over there. It was all over the newspapers, headlines. I mean, and when we came into this town to testify, it was a big deal. We were all over the front page of the paper, the whole deal.
The trial was held before a 3-judge tribunal. The prosecution argued their case with minimal physical evidence. They were counting on Agent McCrary's behavioral profile.
Could you say why there's so many different places?
So it became increasingly important to link these crimes together behaviorally. That really was the only way that Jack could be linked to this entire series of crimes. So that became the critical component in the prosecution of Jack, and where we were most able to assist the Austrian authorities.
Take them to a different spot.
McCrary related to the judges what he had deducted at Quantico. The killer always chose prostitutes, or those who traded sex for favors. He was criminally sophisticated, older, at least in his late 30s. He wasn't panicky nor disorganized. He possessed inner rage, but it was very controlled. The victims had bruises on their wrists as if they had been restrained with handcuffs. McCrary was convinced Unterweger would ask the prostitutes to wear them to fulfill his sexual fantasy. But it was about control. The killer wanted their hands secured to prevent them from resisting.
The bodies were found
McCrary's testimony linked the victims together.
to where they were laid.
Across 2 continents, the trail of deaths followed Jack Unterweger. Where he went, women died. While he visited Los Angeles, 3 prostitutes were murdered, and their slayings mimicked those in Europe. Shannon Exley and the other 2 American women were strangled to death. The offender used their brassieres as ligatures. And Unterweger tied the knots on the ligatures in exactly the same way as he had on the ones in Europe. McCrary pointed out that the probability was infinitesimal that more than one killer committed the crimes.
What are the chances that more than one offender would be not only choosing to ligature strangle a victim with an article of her own clothing, but he would tie the knots in exactly the same way? Very, very remote chance that we've had different offenders committing the crime in that manner.
But the defense argued there was a difference. The victims in Los Angeles had been strangled with their brassieres, and women in Europe had been strangled with their pantyhose. But McCrary countered that European prostitutes do not wear brassieres. What mattered to the killer was that he used an intimate article of the victim's clothing.
The prostitute, I'm sure that he was much more hurried.
LA criminalist Lynn Harold was asked to compare the knots from the pantyhose to those from the bras.
In the case of the pantyhose, you had one leg. The second leg was double-backed on itself and used as the third segment for the weaving or braiding, in a manner extremely similar to one of the bra cases where the 2 pieces of elastic formed 2 segments and the left strap was pulled through as the third braid.
In all, the trial lasted 2.5 months. On June 28, 1994, a jury in Graz, Austria, found Johann Jack Unterweger guilty of 9 of the murders. The remaining victims were found too badly decomposed to convict Unterweger beyond a reasonable doubt. The verdict meant life in prison to a man who swore he would never spend another day behind bars. And he never did. Unterweger strangled himself with a nylon cord stripped from his uniform.
We normally think of suicide as coming from depression or someone who feels shame or guilt or remorseful in some way. This is not at all what was going on when Jack committed suicide. More psychopathic offenders like Jack do it to exert control. And it's the last great defiant act that he exercised to wrest control of this situation away from the government, away from the authorities. He would not allow himself to be imprisoned for the rest of his life.
Jack Unterweger proved that serial killers are not just an American phenomenon. European law enforcement agencies realized that to fight criminals of this sort, they would have to follow the FBI's example.
What we learned out of their case was that in Austria and even in Europe, we didn't have a similar system like VICAP. Violent Crime Apprehension Program. The Criminal Psychology Service trying to get a similar system here to Austria, and therefore we can work with all sex crime cases and homicide cases.
Now, thanks to the lead of the FBI, many countries have adopted profiling and a computerized criminal database in the hopes that open borders and conflicting jurisdictions will no longer allow these predators to escape justice.
Let's start robbery! Everybody down! Go ahead up!
In the 1990s, Seattle, Washington was plagued by hundreds of bank robberies. Most of the thieves were caught, but one continued to elude the FBI. Wearing a disguise, he stole millions, threatening to kill anyone who got in his way. With no leads and little evidence, agents feared the only way to stop him was to catch him in the act.
Every bank teller's worst fear is to stare down the barrel of a robber's gun. Banks use a variety of devices to discourage would-be robbers. Security cameras, silent alarms, and exploding die packs. But when an elusive bank robber targeted Seattle's banks, none of these precautions were effective. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. It would take cunning, precision, and patience to capture a master of disguise the FBI knew only as Hollywood.
Seattle, Washington, 1992. The computer revolution was growing. Technology entrepreneurs were pumping billions into the city's economy. To accommodate the newfound wealth, banks opened branches all over Seattle. But neighborhood convenience also meant more opportunity for theft. On the afternoon of June 25th, at Seafirst Bank's Madison branch, two masked gunmen threatened to shoot anyone who did not comply with their demands.
We're gonna shoot!
One trained his gun on the frightened customers, while the other forced a teller to empty her cash drawer.
Stay down!
After the bag was filled, they demanded car keys from one of the customers who they had watched pull up. They warned the tellers not to hit an alarm or they would return and kill someone. The two sped away with nearly $20,000. Since the bank's deposits were insured by the federal government, the FBI was called in to assist the Seattle police.
One in front and one in the back.
Because no alarm had been tripped, the bank's security cameras were not activated.
If they were ethnic or...
Investigators had no photos of the suspects. Customers and bank employees described the gunman as being of medium height and build. One employee heard the man holding the cash call to his partner using the name Mark.
The guy came to that door and called him.
The robbers had worn gloves so no fingerprints could be obtained. Investigators attempted to lift shoe prints from the desk where one of them had stood. Partial treads were recovered, which investigators believed were made by sneakers. Agents recorded the license plate number of the customer's stolen car, a Cadillac sedan. Hours later, the stolen Cadillac was discovered abandoned in a neighborhood close to the bank. Forensic technicians would pore over the vehicle's interior, but find no fingerprints, hairs, or fibers foreign to the car. 7 weeks passed with no leads. Then, on Friday, August 14th,
this is a robbery! Everybody
the same
down,
bank was robbed again.
Jump.
Though the thief struck alone wearing a new disguise, one of the tellers believed it was the same man. He appeared to be wearing theatrical makeup.
We didn't trip off any alarms. Fill that up.
His take was more than $8,000, and it was just the beginning. Over the next 3 months, the same man hit 4 more Seattle area banks. Each time, a solo gunman wearing theater makeup, a hat, and dark sunglasses was responsible. He brandished a Glock 9mm pistol and threatened to kill anyone who tried to stop him. On his 6th robbery, the thief had gotten away with $252,000, and investigators still had no leads and no name. Special Agent Sean Johnson of the FBI's Seattle field office began tracking this master of disguise, who had come to be known as Hollywood.
It's much easier to coin a name for somebody than to call him tall white male in a blue hat. So with this person in particular, he wore, once again, this elaborate facial disguise, makeup. So somewhere along the line, somebody started calling him Hollywood because of that, and that name stuck with him.
Hollywood had gone silent since he'd robbed Seafirst Bank's Hawthorne branch in northeast Seattle. His take from that location exceeded $250,000. To date, Hollywood had grabbed over $320,000 from Seattle area banks. Authorities had recovered none of the stolen cash, and they still had no clues to his identity. As the months passed, investigators wondered if he had quit or moved on to another city. Then, on November 24th, 1993, just over a year since his last heist, Hollywood struck again. Brandishing his trademark Glock pistol, Hollywood herded the customers together.
Don't move. Money on the counter.
He returned to Seafirst Bank's Hawthorne branch, the bank he had previously hit for more than $250,000. He asked for the reserve cash. Unsatisfied with the cash drawer take, he ordered a teller to let him into the vault in a back room. Hollywood emerged with nearly $100,000. Again, he threatened to kill anyone who hit an alarm. No one disobeyed his orders.
When Hollywood came into the banks, he was very much in control. He was polite to a degree, but it didn't make people comfortable. They were very afraid that he would use the weapon. He brandished it. It actually pointed at a number of people during the course of the robberies. So we knew that he was not afraid to show the weapon and also to possibly use that weapon against somebody who didn't obey what he told them to do.
Security strategies in Seattle banks at this time included using marked bills to trace stolen money. Another tactic was dye packs. Hidden inside a stack of bills, the packs contain red dye and an electronic charge.
All right, it's going to work for you. At least underneath one sack.
The pack detonates and stains a thief when he crosses sensors at the bank's exit.
Safes is tied in.
Silent alarms made it possible for tellers to call the police without alerting the robbers.
Wait till they get out. Once you press that button,
Video cameras monitored every corner of the bank.
They'll take a picture about every 7 seconds.
So far, Hollywood had somehow managed to defeat all these measures. July 13th, 1994. Hollywood attacked his 10th bank in 2 years. He used a stun gun to threaten bank employees. A teller risked her life pushing a silent alarm.
754 North Independence, Westlake Bank and Trust, robbery in progress.
Hollywood looted the cash drawer, unaware that patrol units were racing to the scene.
Shut up and don't touch anybody! You know, A3, don't touch anybody. Go! All right, good.
He fled with nearly $112,000. A witness outside the bank saw him get into a dark blue Dodge Caravan. The second person drove it. The witness was unable to see the vehicle's license tag. After police secured the scene, another bank employee arrived for work.
Oh, very good, thank you. Just tell me what you saw.
He told police about an incident on the previous day. The employee noticed a man taking notes in front of the bank, standing next to a blue Dodge Caravan. The witness said he was too far away to get a good look at his face.
Look, I appreciate you coming forward, and if you can think of any other details.
To Agent Johnson, it appeared that Hollywood studied the locations before striking.
He would scout out the banks days before, get a feel for the layout, who came, who went from the bank at given times.
Hollywood's planning was paying off. He had gotten away with over $660,000. He struck most often on Wednesdays or Thursdays. The next time he appeared was 6 months later. As he filled his bag, the teller overheard a radio call from beneath his coat urging him to exit. When he passed the bank's sensors, a dye pack exploded. For the first time, he had failed in a robbery attempt. A witness outside the bank took down the license plate number of the getaway car. Special Agent Johnson was able to trace the vehicle.
We ran the license plates from the cars, and they came back to a couple who lived in Tacoma, Washington, south of Seattle. So I went and talked to the couple to find out how their car had been sold.
They had advertised the car in a local paper.
He did ask if it run, and we told him
The buyer paid $1,200 in cash without test driving it. The couple described the buyer as a white male in his late 30s or early 40s, of medium height and weight. Based on their description, a sketch artist created a likeness of the suspect.
Gee, I think that looks a lot.
The FBI now had their first glimpse of what Hollywood might look like. By the spring of 1995, a masked Seattle gunman had robbed 12 banks of nearly $1 million and left behind few clues. Investigators dubbed him Hollywood for his use of disguises and theatrical makeup. The only lead that agents had was a sketch of what they believed was the face behind the mask. Special Agent Sean Johnson looked for a pattern. If he could figure out similarities among the banks Hollywood robbed, perhaps he could predict when and where he would strike next.
I went back and visited all the banks that Hollywood had hit since June of '92. What I was looking for was some commonality. How many doors were in the banks? What was the layout of the lobby? Where was the vault located? Was it downstairs, upstairs, on the main floor? What was the size of the parking lot? Was it adjacent to the bank? Was it across the street? What kind of street was this bank located on?
Johnson discovered that most of the banks were in commercial districts where area businesses made their deposits. The banks also bordered residential areas. This enabled Hollywood to blend into the surrounding neighborhood without arousing suspicion.
He liked 3 areas of the city primarily, the northeast part of town, Madison Park, which is just outside of downtown, and West Seattle. So once again, looking at the types of banks he hit, the branches themselves, and areas of the city, we came up with a pattern of likely targets.
In March of 1995, 3 years after Hollywood's initial heist, the Puget Sound Violent Crimes Task Force was formed. Staffed with investigators from 5 different agencies, they had one goal in mind: to take Hollywood off the streets. Hollywood struck most often around noon, and almost always on the last 3 days of the work week. 4 of his past 5 robberies occurred in late January or early February. Agents calculated that Hollywood appeared to be going through about $20,000 a month. Detective Mike McGann joined the task force in June of 1995. McGann knew the streets and had many bank robbery collars to his credit.
It was my belief that at least 95% of the people that I arrested were narcotics users. The other 5% I believed to be gamblers, thrill seekers, professionals, or people that were working out of sheer desperation. Where I'd classify Hollywood was that he was a well-trained, well-disciplined professional.
McGann pored over the security camera photos of Hollywood. He noted the weapons he brandished were a 9mm Glock and a stun gun. At the time, these arms were being considered as weapons of choice among law enforcement. The detective also noticed that Hollywood indexed his trigger finger on the side of the 9mm, a technique taught to police officers. Many of the robberies occurred in the late morning, between 11 a.m. and noon, precisely the time when a shift change for the Seattle police occurred. The evidence pointed to a frightening possibility. Hollywood might be a cop.
And the reason I thought he was a police officer is he knew so much about how we operated, that he was probably watching us or listening to us. He was disciplined. He was in and out of the banks quickly. He moved swiftly. He just knew a lot about the policy procedures of the bank. He knew that the areas that he was hitting in were primarily residential areas that don't have much police presence in them.
Then something else caught his eye. He noticed that Hollywood was wearing a radio on his belt. If Hollywood was communicating with a walkie, perhaps police could intercept the transmission. The detective contacted an electronics expert known as the Glitch. With his help, McGann hoped to gain an advantage.
Rectangle, gray, brown, like that.
I had sat down with this person and showed him the surveillance photographs of Hollywood and the two-way radio he had, and he was able to determine the frequency most common to those radios that he would work off, and it was 2 different frequencies.
The Glitch offered to rig up a scanner in McGann's unmarked car. By eavesdropping on Hollywood, investigators hoped they could pinpoint his whereabouts and catch him in the act. The idea didn't work. Special Agent Johnson was stationed outside a bank in northeast Seattle, monitoring the radio, when Hollywood and an accomplice struck elsewhere.
It's about 11:30. I was going to break off about 12 o'clock, and all of a sudden I heard the Seattle police radio saying we've had a bank robbery, First Interstate Bank, and that was about 2 miles from my location. I heard the physical description. I knew at that point it was Hollywood, and he had come back on one of those 3 days I predicted a year before, and we dismissed him.
A bystander outside the bank got the license number. Like his first robbery, the getaway car was found in a neighborhood near the bank. The FBI traced the car back to its owner, who said he had sold it to a man for cash a few weeks earlier.
I had the owner come up and look at the vehicle, and I said, "Is there anything different about this car from when you sold it?" And he said, "Sure."
Overall condition of your engine compartment here, is anything?
The owner noticed the car had a new battery.
Different here? You notice any difference? I was about to say.
Agents found that the car had been wiped down inside and out. The owner also noticed that 2 of the tires had been replaced with newer ones.
So I went to trace the tires, found out they'd been bought in Tacoma, Washington. The battery had been bought at a Sears store in Tacoma about 2 days after the car was purchased. So I knew at that point that these people, whether it was Hollywood and or his partners, were in the area at least 2 months before the robberies.
Working with a sketch artist, the owner described the buyer. Investigators now had 2 composite sketches, but they were still no closer to catching Hollywood. Supervisory Special Agent Ellen Glasser was brought in to head the task force. She made the decision to go on the offensive.
It's one thing to put pen to paper and to put your thought processes at work and try to solve a case. It's another when you take a proactive posture in an investigation, knowing that you might get into a confrontation with somebody like Hollywood.
The supervisor realized that a more aggressive stance would place her agents in greater peril. Hollywood had repeatedly threatened to kill anyone who tried to stop him.
We knew he had a propensity for violence and figured that if he was going to these elaborate means to disguise himself to plan the robberies, that he probably would not necessarily give up easily as most others did. And we were concerned about safety of law enforcement and safety of customers and employees of the banks.
Okay, he's taking a lot of care.
More personnel were assigned to specific areas of the city, targeting the banks hit most often by Hollywood.
So we came up with a game plan saying, okay, we're going to be out on the streets on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays between these periods of time, knowing full well that greed would probably take the better part of Hollywood and he would come back and rob another bank, even with the amount of money he'd already taken.
On May 22, 1996, despite the increased presence of law enforcement, Hollywood hit the First Interstate Bank in the affluent suburb of Madison Park. It was his 14th known robbery. To generate leads, agents reached out to the community.
We increased the reward to $50,000 that we were offering in the community for tips. We didn't want to have the media work against us. Now, we didn't want to glamorize Hollywood and cause copycat bank robbers to go out and rob banks. But we also felt that we needed the public.
Agents saturated Madison Park with hundreds of wanted flyers. Perhaps heightened public awareness could also help eliminate that neighborhood as a potential target. Then, law enforcement could increase manpower in the remaining neighborhoods. The campaign yielded nothing. Hollywood had not surfaced in months. They consulted a police profiler to learn how Hollywood might react if and when he was cornered.
Could be someone who is familiar or someone who was taken out of.
Based on his broad knowledge of violent criminal behavior, the profiler told them that Hollywood would not go quietly.
And it was very important for us to hear him say, this guy is going to resist arrest. This guy will not want to go into custody. This guy will fight you. This guy is dangerous.
Authorities could only guess when and where Hollywood would strike next, and if his gun would remain silent. For almost 4 years, Hollywood had threatened to shoot anyone who got in his way. Agents were convinced that if he was challenged, the masked gunman would shoot to kill. By 1996, a masked gunman known only as Hollywood had robbed 14 Seattle banks.
Trip off any alarms.
He threatened to kill dozens of people for his take of $1.2 million over 4 years. Though Hollywood had not fired his weapon, agents believed that if confronted, he would kill. Supervisory Special Agent Ellen Glasser showed the task force a videotape of what could happen if they were not prepared.
We have been using for training in the FBI a video of the tragic firefight that took place in 1986 in Miami, where we lost 2 of our agents and several other agents were wounded. What they were doing that day is they were on a surveillance for 2 dangerous bank robbery suspects. So there were some obvious parallels to what we were doing.
On April 11th, 1986, the FBI confronted 2 armed bank robbers in Miami. A shootout erupted. The gunmen advanced while the agents were reloading their revolvers, killing 2 of them and seriously wounding 5 others.
That Miami shootout was a reminder of how high the stakes were. We can't always be 100% prepared, but we should be thinking. Have a plan.
All right, come on.
Set. Moving.
To avoid repeating the tragedy that occurred in Miami, Glasser developed more uniform procedures between the various agencies. The Seattle SWAT team trained alongside Special Agent Johnson.
We did extensive training with them, firearms training, felony car stops, how to take people out of cars, different situations and how we'd respond to a bank robbery that Hollywood had committed. And that was all done under Ellen Glasser's supervision. And her #1 concern, of course, was the safety of all the people involved.
Yeah.
FBI, get out, get out, get out!
Detective McGann knew they needed to make sure all personnel were on the same page.
It also gave us a chance to test our communications because the FBI doesn't work off police communications, they had their own. So what we had to do is get everybody on board on the same radio frequency.
To prevent the danger of friendly fire, all personnel were required to wear clothing with emblazoned logos.
It looked really good otherwise, but you had your head out just a little too long.
As Thanksgiving approached, Glasser believed they were as prepared as they could be.
360 is all around. It's not just.
Well, that Wednesday, that day before Thanksgiving in 1996, it started out just like any other day. I went to work thinking I was going to catch up on some of my overdue paperwork, thinking that I was looking forward to the holiday the next day, having a day off, the banks would be closed, and thinking that people needed a rest because they had been working so hard.
Agent Glasser, Detective McGann, and Detective Pete Erickson were the last ones in the office when an alert tone came over the radio at 5:41.
And upon hearing that, I knew that it was Hollywood that had hit. And I'm looking around the office thinking, well, Pete's here. And I looked at him and said, do you want to go? He goes, oh yeah, let's go. And Ellen saw me run down the hall and she's yelling, Mike, what's going on? I said, Hollywood hit, do you want to go? She goes, yes. So she grabbed her coat and we all left the task force office. And my car was parked right outside the front door. We ran down and turned on the lights and the siren and put the light on the roof, and away we went.
Multiple suspects had robbed a bank in Lake City, the Seattle suburb just minutes from task force headquarters.
As soon as we got into Mike's car, I could hear the Seattle police radio traffic. And I remember hearing the references to the makeup. And it was really those references to the pancake makeup that made it resonate in my head that this was it. This was it.
They got another call. A witness had seen a vehicle exit the bank's parking lot in an erratic manner. A vehicle matching the description had been spotted. The police believed they had found the getaway car. It turned out to be a false alarm. The engine was cold. 20 minutes had passed since the first call. McGann was sure that Hollywood had transferred to a different vehicle by now.
He would need a place to change. He would need a place to take that makeup off, that wig off, to change his clothing, to put the weapons, so put the weapons away, or the money. The getaway car there would most likely be a van.
Detective McGann continued to cruise the side streets in the residential area near the bank. From past robberies, McGann and Agent Glasser knew this was where he would most likely change vehicles.
Some units were responding to one location, and Mike was saying, that's not him, that's not him. He'd patrolled in these streets. He'd grown up in Seattle. He knew every nook and cranny of the town in that area.
After several minutes of crisscrossing the main roads, they pulled up behind a white van.
And there was condensation on the insides of the windows. I mean, heavy condensation where the beads of water were dripping down on the insides of the van. But there were flashlights moving about the van, real quick light, and it had dark windows, tinted windows on it.
McGann had a strong suspicion it was Hollywood. They called in to check the plates. The driver of the van ignored the emergency lights and pulled away.
Dispatch. Vehicle.
The investigators had no way of knowing how many persons were in the van, or if they had any weapons. If it was Hollywood, they knew at the very least he would be carrying a 9mm Glock.
By this time, I knew he knew we were behind him. He could see me. He just knew we were there. And he drove northbound and slowly came to a stop.
They prepared to approach the idling van.
When I got out, all I saw was this person holding the rifle at port arms and stepped out from the side and took aim at me with that rifle. And right then I feared that I was going to be shot and killed.
The rifle jammed. McGann fired into the rear of the van. The chase had turned into a firefight.
Get in.
On the night before Thanksgiving, 1996, 3 investigators had just fired at a fleeing van after its driver had attempted to shoot them with a rifle. They believe the van held a man known only as Hollywood, an elusive bank robber. Special Agent Sean Johnson responded to the call for backup.
My pager went off. I looked at it and knew immediately there had been a bank robbery. I called the office and was told that Hollywood, based on the description that they had gotten, Hollywood had just robbed a bank, Seafirst Bank, Lake City branch in the north part of town.
Still several miles away, Johnson raced to the location. As the van came to another stop, backup arrived. The gunman ducked back into the van and the chase resumed. Special Agent Glasser felt it was a miracle the 3 of them had survived unharmed.
I think that's partially by the grace of God, because these rounds were found in the windshield of the car that was behind us, so they went right over us.
They continued to pursue the unidentified gunman through the residential neighborhood. The agent updated their new position for approaching units. They followed the van until it disappeared around a turn. Fearful he might be driving into an ambush, McGann got out and continued the pursuit on foot. Detective McGann told a canine officer to cover the right side while he moved up on the left.
And I'm trying to think, am I doing everything right? I'm alive, there's no bullet holes in me, my coworkers are alive, plenty of help is behind us, and I knew plenty of help was in front of us coming at us.
Up ahead, they could see the lights from an approaching Seattle police cruiser. It intercepted the van, forcing it off the road. The van had come to rest in the front yard of a house. Investigators still had no idea how many were in the vehicle.
Right.
Out of the van! Keep your hands where we can see them!
Right. Doors are open!
The side doors burst open, but no one came out.
Cover me! Out of the van! Keep your hands out where we can see them! Keep your hands out!
2 men, badly wounded, were pulled from the van.
Keep your hands out!
One suspect had taken 3 rounds. The bullets had penetrated his left shoulder, thigh, and stomach. The other had been hit in his right shoulder.
When I looked down at him and said, "What's your name?" and he said, "Steve." I said, "Steve what?" and he said, "Steve Myers." And I said, "Are you Hollywood?" and he says, "No."
The other suspect was taller and heavier than the gunman from the security camera photos. Police believed he was not Hollywood either. The detective turned his attention to the van, but no one else was inside.
And I'm thinking, where's the third suspect? You're saying the suspect got out. Are you positive? And they're saying, yes, he got out when he saw us. He took off. So I'm thinking, oh my God.
Investigators quickly organized a search, both on the ground and in the air. A third suspect, probably Hollywood, was on the run. Police believed he was armed. They did not know how far he could get if he was wounded. As the search continued, a forensics team processed the van.
And in the back of the van, there was a guitar case that had been converted into a gun-carrying case, and a blue nylon bag that had money in it. And it was a big bag of money.
The robbers had left behind more than $1 million. They also found pieces of a latex mask, most likely belonging to Hollywood. Scattered around the blood-soaked interior, investigators found an assault rifle, a semi-automatic shotgun, 2 pistols, and several boxes of ammunition. Hollywood's Glock 9mm pistol was nowhere to be found.
Could have taken hostage in a house, yeah. That did cross my mind that, you know, maybe he ran into a house and was holding a family hostage and would hold them until, you know, the early hours of the morning, or until traffic died out, or he could be watching us. He could be one of us.
Wherever he was and whoever he was, Hollywood had eluded the FBI once more. After 4 years of pursuit, the masked bank robber known as Hollywood had eluded capture again following his 15th known bank robbery. But 2 of his accomplices had been taken into custody. One was identified as Mark Biggins. Biggins had been Hollywood's accomplice in 3 of the robberies, including their first. He wore the Reagan mask. The other accomplice was Steve Myers, the man who drove Hollywood's getaway cars. Special Agent Johnson pressed Myers for Hollywood's real name.
You need to tell me who this person is, where he is. And he finally said, okay, I'll tell you. The person you're looking for is Scott Scurlock.
Scott Scurlock wasn't a police officer. He was a local actor. Agents moved in on his 20-acre ranch in Olympia, Washington, an hour south of Seattle.
Yeah, search warrant. Clear left.
But no one was there.
Clear.
Investigators found a semi-automatic 9mm Glock.
Okay. Secured up. And our 9s. All right, check it out.
Agents recovered $23,000 in cash. The searchers also found a dozen pairs of canvas athletic shoes, the same kind that Hollywood was reported to have worn in several robberies.
Check over here.
Behind the house, agents approached a barn.
All right, clear left. Clear.
Inside, they found tools, building materials, and equipment. On the dusty floor, one of the agents noticed some footprints that led to a trap door. It opened into an underground chamber.
See a light switch anywhere?
Right here.
Agents had no way of knowing if Hollywood was hiding there with a gun. Scurlock wasn't there. But behind a curtain, they discovered a second room. It was a complete makeup studio. The agents also found a photograph of Scurlock without makeup.
Is this who we've been looking for? It's gotta be. Is this Hollywood? That's the man. It's gotta be.
Behind the barn, Special Agent Sean Johnson and his team came across a large treehouse.
It sat about 60 feet up into the trees. It was built on 7 cedar trees. It consisted of 3 stories. It had numerous ramps that extended out from the treehouse. It was something to behold.
Agents searched the treehouse. They found no sign of Scurlock. Police were still patrolling the neighborhood where the shootout had occurred the night before. Searchers had combed the area, but found no trace of the fugitive. Then a report came in that a man had spotted someone hiding in a camper behind his mother's house.
Come out of the trailer.
Police responded and approached the camper.
Sir, police officer, come out of the trailer.
They identified themselves, but received no response. An officer emptied a can of pepper spray into the window.
Police, come out of the trailer.
A shot rang out.
Chief, get your back up.
Police set up a perimeter around the camper and called in reinforcements. Agent Johnson had just returned from searching Scurlock's property.
Within minutes of arriving at the office, having not even unloaded the evidence, I heard on the Seattle police radio shots had been exchanged at a location about 2 blocks away from the previous night's events. So without even beginning to unload the evidence, I took off again, heading northbound out of town, lights and sirens to this location.
Every available unit converged on the site. Supervisory Special Agent Glasser had gone home after the shootout.
By that point in time, I had decided not to cook a turkey on Thanksgiving. I had changed the reservations for where we were going to eat Thanksgiving to a later time so that we could all be together as a family. And we were almost out the door when we got a call from the office that Hollywood was barricaded in a trailer.
No other shots had been fired since that first exchange.
Come on, Scott, come out. Just show up.
Scurlock's girlfriend was brought to the scene. If it was the fugitive, perhaps she could persuade him to give himself up.
Come on, Scott, come out.
There was no response. Nobody knew for sure who was in the camper. Out of options, the SWAT team was called to action. Hoping to flush out the suspect, they fired 2 rounds of tear gas into his refuge. They heard nothing. SWAT members entered cautiously.
And the initial radio communication from the SWAT team said there's lots of blood, but we see no body. And my first reaction to that was, is this guy a ghost or what? How can there be no body? And then just seconds later they say, we've got a body.
Through the smoke, a white male could be seen lying lifeless on the floor, a gun near his head. Scurlock's photograph was compared to the body. It matched. The coroner later determined that his death had been self-inflicted. Mark Biggins recovered from his wounds. He and Steve Myers pled guilty to bank robbery, assault on a federal officer, and firearms violations. They were sentenced to 21 years in a federal prison. Scott Scurlock had hidden behind a mask for 4.5 years. But when the FBI struck back, the man they called Hollywood found there was no place left to hide.